And joining us now on the debate, David Dodge, former governor of the Bank of Canada, now senior advisor at Bennett Jones LLP. Jim Stanford, economist with the Canadian Auto Workers Union. Michael Decter, president and CEO with Lawrence Decter Investment Counsel. And Matthew Mendelson, director of the Mowat Center for Policy Innovation. Gentlemen, it's good to have you all here around our table for a discussion which, let's confess it right here, which was prompted by your comments in the Globe and Mail of just over a week ago. And Michael, if you would, let's bring this quote up and we'll get this started. Here's how the Globe reported it. Quote, given the current strength of the Canadian currency and fragility of the U.S. economy, he says, we in Ontario are in an extremely difficult position. The worst of it, he says, that's you, David Dodge, is that none of the province's three main political parties appear willing to admit that jobs and corporate tax revenues are potentially at risk. More disconcerting are the absence of viable economic strategies and incentives to attract manufacturing investment. His most pointed criticisms are directed at Ontario's three main political leaders who are campaigning for an October election. Each leader, he warns, is promoting, quote, impossible economic plans that unrealistically promise lower taxes and improve services for a province that he believes is facing a shrinking tax revenue base. And here's the quote, David Dodge, whoever wins will be seen to have lied to the public. Okay, what prompted you to say all that?
Well, you got it in the first part of the quote. We're going to have slow growth, even under a fairly optimistic scenario. We're going to have slow growth. Our major trading partner, the United States, is in trouble. We have a high Canadian dollar. We have high energy prices. We have a slow-growing labor force in this province. And all of that adds up that with the existing tax base, if we're lucky, those tax revenues in nominal terms will rise about 4% a year for the next 4 or 5 years, if we're lucky. And we need almost all of that to bring down the deficit if we are to hit the deficit target that is out there of balancing the books in 2016-17. Now, one can challenge that, whether that's the right thing to do, but...
I thought it was 17-18. I think they're all promising 17-18.
Well,
it's a long way off.
It's a long way off.
It's not during this next mandate.
It's not during this mandate. But in order to get there, right through the piece, we're going to have rising debt service costs. Mm-hmm. And what does that leave over for everything else? Just about exactly zero in nominal terms.
Michael Decter, the suggestion here is that, you know this expression these days, none of the major party leaders out there is prepared to have a really adult conversation with the electorate about what's going to be required to balance the books. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with Kim Campbell that sadly, and she didn't put sadly in front of it, election campaigns are no time to talk about serious issues. She was widely denounced for having this view and didn't do well in that election. But I'm afraid that what she said is true, that what's come to be is election campaigns driven by polling, focus groups. All of the party leaders try and hit the 4 or 5 hot button issues that they think will appeal to the public. And then when somebody wins and they're back in government, they have to deal with the harsh reality that what we've got in Ontario are a set of services that are outsized to the revenue we have to support them. So, and you know, you could see no clearer example of this than healthcare, which if you take out public debt charges is about half of the provincial spend. And you have, because of a 6% federal transfer, a kind of idea about that 6% is a sustainable growth rate. Both of the major parties, if you look closely at their numbers, have built in a 3% assumption. Mm-hmm. But this very week, the doctors of Ontario, one of the biggest groups and the wealthiest, got a 4.5% increase in their fee schedule. Now, it's off a 3-year-old agreement, but you're not going to convince the rest of the healthcare community that the docs got 4.5 and we got to put some water in our wine and take 0, which Dwight Duncan has been quite unsuccessfully doing. So what I'd say is, I mean, there are other things than health, but in a slow growth economy, the tax revenues can either go to a 3% increase in health or they can go to paying down the deficit. You can't spend them twice.
Do you hear much honest talk about debts and deficits and shrinking tax revenue bases and that kind of thing on the hustings right now?
Well, I agree with both Michael and David, and I'm just honored to be in everyone's presence here. I'm a little bit more charitable.
You honored to be with Jim
I'm
as well?
honored to be with Jim. Always honored to be with Jim.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm glad you slipped that in.
I'm a little bit more charitable towards the parties, in part because they're using private sector forecasts, all of them.
From last February.
From last February, but you can't change your campaign platform every day based on evolving situations, and we are in an evolving situation right now globally and economically, and people just have to look to what's going on in Europe or the United States. Clearly, all of the risks are on the downside, and the structural issues that David has talked about in terms of the dollar, the weakness in the U.S. economy, all of those things are real threats, and the risks are on the downside. And so I do think that thoughtful citizens look at all of the campaign platforms with a grain of salt, and try and look at the underlying values and direction that the parties want to take the province in. And the inventory of options is pretty clear. You either do service cuts, you find increased revenue somewhere, whether that's tax increases or something else, or you really try and transform how government delivers its services, how doctors work, how nurses work. You go across the board. And so I agree that voters should be looking at all of the platforms with a grain of salt, but looking at what the underlying values are of each of those platforms and what direction they're promising to take the province in when downside risk emerges, if it does.
We'll start to unpack some of those ideas as we go along here. Do you agree with Michael Decter channeling Kim Campbell that election times are really, if not impossible, at least really difficult times in which to have adult conversations about these kinds of things?
Well, it is kind of ironic, I guess, Steve, that Ontario has a large deficit. It's not a gigantic deficit, but it's a big deficit.
It's $16 billion.
15 is what it came in, and it's actually in the last couple of years it's outperformed the targets. So we can talk about the forecast going forward, but so far we've actually been beating the targets. Yet it isn't the debate in the election, and the reason is because the three parties all took the same fiscal forecast that the finance minister delivered in the last budget, and then used that as their base, and then they're all riffing off that forecast with their own promises about incremental spending or incremental tax cuts. So in a way, they've all accepted the timeline, and frankly, I think that's the appropriate timeline in terms of charting a course for deficit reduction. Because the problem is, as David Dodge said at the beginning, the economy is weak. That's what caused the deficit. Okay, remember, it seems like ancient history, but in 2007, before the financial crisis and the recession, we had a balanced budget. So it isn't a structural mismatch. It's that Ontario's economy had the stuffing knocked out of it, and we haven't recovered yet. And if in that kind of a weak macro environment, you go at the thing with a gigantic axe to cut spending and have austerity at all costs, then you end up in the same sort of self-defeating cycle as we've seen in Europe, where the deeper they cut, the worse the economy gets, the worse the debt becomes.
I'd be interested to hear whether you agree with his assessment of why we're running $15 billion deficits these days.
Largely. But I think we do have to remember that unfortunately, the terms of trade have moved against Ontario. We have to produce more of whatever we produce in order to buy the things we import, whether it's oil or iron ore or whatever. And that means that transformation was really starting in the middle of the last decade. It's been heightened, of course, by the recession. But we've got a structural problem of long duration, which we've got to come to grips with. We've had virtually no product.
He just said no. He said we don't have a structural deficit.
No, a structural problem. I was quite clear here that we have relied in Ontario on strong markets in the U.S., on being competitive in that Midwest market. We've got a high dollar now that's going to persist because oil prices and natural resource prices have gone up. And so we are, in fact, having to produce more of whatever we produce in order to buy what we import. It just takes more cars to buy a barrel of oil than it did in 10 years ago or even 5 years ago.
Michael.
The strong economies in the world are in Asia. You've got 40 countries that have been growing above 8%. And they are helping Canada a great deal, but they're not helping Ontario. In fact, they're probably hurting Ontario because what they've done is put commodity prices on the ceiling. So you've got a very high oil prices, copper prices, iron ore. This benefits enormously Newfoundland, Labrador, to an extent northern Quebec, certainly Alberta and Saskatchewan, and somewhat BC. But Ontario, like the United States, tends to be an importer, so it's a manufacturer, and it's very hard for Ontario to become as competitive as the competitors in Asia. I mean, we've historically just had to outcompete the Americans.
And
but now the Europeans, but the two most profitable car companies in the world, the last time I looked, were Kia out of Korea and Volkswagen out of Germany. So, you know, we've brought back the auto industry in Ontario with a lot of government help, and it's competitive in a North American context, but we're not ever going to ship cars from Ontario to Asia. What's going to happen is GM in China and, you know, Ford in Asia will build cars over there. And so we do have this problem that Ontario may be, for the longer haul, on a slower growth trajectory, even if Canada does relatively well in the world.
All of which points to the fact that we've talked about a number of issues in the campaign so far. I mean, healthcare has come up, the state of the education system has come up, foreign workers have come up. Debt and deficit reduction has really not, the parties certainly haven't gone there, and there has been precious little in the mass media about it either. Now, Matthew Mendelson, if we're 7 years potentially away from balancing our books, meaning we're going to go another, who knows what, 50 billion in debt between now and then, how good is that for our economy?
Well, it's not good, and clearly it won't be 50 billion, or it's not projected to be 50 billion, because the debt recovery will happen and the deficits will get progressively slower. But debt charges and debt financing will continue to increase, which will squeeze out other services. We're very aware of the vicious cycle and the virtuous circle that occurred in Canada in the 90s and 2000, where growing deficits squeeze out other spending. And
so
as
should
you
we
pay,
more aggressively go after deficit reduction right now?
Well, what I think we should be doing is really looking at how we can deliver public services more efficiently and continue to do so with fewer resources, and try and bring some of those deficits down more quickly. I mean, Michael was talking about healthcare and agreement with the doctors. I mean, when you look at our healthcare model, even within the context of a single-payer public system, yes, healthcare costs have been going up, but you can extract lots of money from that system. I mean, we have a system built for the 1970s or 1980s. I mean, just to give you one example, doctors aren't allowed to use the telephone. We don't pay doctors to use the telephone, to fill prescriptions by phone. I mean, you could fill probably 3 times more prescriptions by phone than by in-house services.
Right? Is that true?
We have actually now put fees in
That's
for
what I
some
thought.
of that.
Yeah,
but,
for some of it.
But
yeah.
the point is, we're still running a system that's based on visits when we should be running a system that's based on actual transactions.
How about Twitter?
electronically.
Can we fill the prescriptions on Twitter yet?
We may be filling a few too many prescriptions, is my only
But tell me,
concern.
Well,
are you
that's
concerned?
a different issue.
Are you concerned, Jim, that the deficit reduction targets aren't quick enough? We're not looking to balance books in this province for another 7 years?
Balancing the books shouldn't be the be-all and end-all goal. In a way, the most important question that largely isn't being discussed in this campaign is the prior question. I mean, we, I think, have agreed between us that the bulk of the deficit problem reflects what's happened to Ontario's economy, and the unemployment, the lost jobs, the lost tax revenues, and the increased social spending because of it. So the crucial challenge is, how are we going to put Ontarians back to work, producing goods and services, generating income, and, by the way, paying taxes? And on that score, I think the campaign has been too silent as well. I mean, there are some differences between the three parties in terms of their vision of job creation and getting the economy back. The Conservatives is more in the sort of traditional cut taxes and let the business sector do it. The Liberals and the NDP have each got different proposals for sort of promoting growth and promoting job creation. But I ultimately think that will be the crucial issue. If we can put Ontarians back to work, then we'll pay down that deficit, no problem.
I should ask David Dodge about this, because everybody talks about the 3 main parties. We've actually had the 4 main parties represented on this program when we invite nominated candidates to come in, because the Greens are actually promising to reduce the deficit, to balance the books by 2016, 2 years ahead of the other 3 mainline parties. And they say they would do it by obviously radically restructuring the tax system, bring in a carbon tax, reduce some corporate taxes and, raise some corporate taxes and do some other things as well. Can that be done? Could you balance the books by 2016?
Well, can is not the operative word. Of course it can.
Is it advisable?
It can be done. The question is whether you should aim for that. Now, let's be very clear, though. You get to where Greece or Portugal is over a long, slippery slope. And what is really quite important is that we stabilize what's called the debt to GDP ratio, right? And at the moment, we are on a trajectory where if everything goes right, we'll stabilize it at roughly 40% of GDP, up from 30 back in 2007, right? If things go the least little bit wrong, it could well go well above that. And what happens then? We end starting to pay a bigger and bigger premium for borrowing. Not only do the debt service costs rise, but they rise even faster because we end paying a premium for borrowing.
Let's put that into context insofar as if our debt to the size of the economy is 30 to 40%, what is it in the United States right now?
Well, hang on. That's the provincial debt,
The provincial,
right?
okay.
So, and the federal is about 32. So for you and I as Ontarians, in a sense, we will be carrying roughly 70% because we pay, there's only one taxpayer, right? Now that's not outrageous. That's not outrageous. And I think at 40, we probably don't have very much of a credit downgrade. But if it keeps slipping, and if people see it keep slipping away, then we run into trouble. And the best time to fix a problem is before it arrives. Trying to fix it after it arrives is very difficult.
I think that's quite true. One point to keep in mind that's been to our favor has been interest rates have stayed very low, including the interest premium on Canadian government debt, because international financiers love Canada right now. They even love Ontario. So in that regard, interest costs on that deficit have actually been lower than we all expected them to be. So that's a bit of a silver lining, if you like.
Well, the other silver lining has been because mortgage rates have been so low, we've had a full recovery in our housing sector. Or over full recovery,
what does that
whereas
mean?
the Americans haven't. Well, you know, a lot of young people have bought condos and houses because mortgage rates are 3.5%. When we get back to a more normal interest rate, I mean, inflation's at 3%, so rates would normally carry a premium above inflation. Our central bank can't raise rates because the American rates are so low, and it would, in my view, generally drive our dollar up and hurt competitiveness. So we're kind of in this trap where it's a virtuous trap in the short term. Low interest rates are very helpful, but when they spike up, which they will inevitably do, we may see some of the downturn in housing that the U.S. has experienced. Not, I don't think, the catastrophic kind of thing, because thanks to David Dodge, we never went for the subprime mortgage road, which is very dangerous. But there is some, you know, we've had a good housing boom in Canada, and it won't go on forever. You do run out of buyers at some point. And
let me ask Matthew about this number. The number is $215 billion, and that is the size of the province's debt as of the end of the last fiscal year. Is that an outrageous number?
No, it's not an outrageous number, but David is completely right that you don't get to be Greece overnight. It is gradual, and I think all parties should be dealing with it sensibly and talking about it. I think debt and deficit have not been prominent issues in this campaign. I would agree with that. I think that all parties, voters should look at all parties' platforms and look at how realistic they think they are, how many large spending commitments they're making, what their expectations are on taxes. And I would say that all parties have not been talking about deficit and debt. I mean, people come at it from different perspectives, but I don't think that number is an outrageous number. I think it's certainly serviceable, but the question is how quickly it is going up and what happens in the future if it continues to go up.
We have, David Dodge, right now in Ontario, one party, the Progressive Conservatives, that are promising to cut people's income taxes and corporate taxes. We have the Liberals who are promising to cut corporate taxes, but no other tax increases, they swear. The New Democrats are promising an increase in corporate taxes, but no other taxes, they swear. In fact, some tax cuts in other areas. And the Greens, of course, promising to do some major tax shifting. You can't promise tax increases, or you can't even utter the word tax increases on Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario anymore without getting shouted down.
Why not?
Is that, yeah, that's my question.
Why not? I mean, look, we should always, as citizens, make sure that governments deliver what we're paying for. But as citizens, we also have to recognize that we've got to pay for what we expect government to deliver to us, right? And so as we look forward over the next 4 or 5 years, we don't have very many choices. We can pay more in taxes or fees, user charges, or a carbon tax or whatever, and maintain the same level of service, and hopefully at the same time generate some productivity growth in the public sector, although we should come back and talk about that. Or we can see a major service reduction, or we can have some combination of the two. And that's what we face, and that's what we really should be talking about. And guess what really bothers me? I have great respect for the electorate. But for government to operate, it has to have the trust of citizens. And the quickest way to lose trust of the citizens is to say you're going to do one thing, and then next February, when the budget arrives, have to do something else. Mm-hmm. And we have to have that trust in government. And what I'm afraid of, whoever wins, because of what they're going to have to do next February and the following February, they're going to lose that trust. And once that's lost, it is very hard to get back.
Michael Decter, though, are we not at a point in our kind of political life in this province where you just simply can't campaign on raising taxes because you'll lose?
Well, we did raise, you know, the McGuinty government did a couple of big tax raises.
They didn't campaign on it, though.
Well, they didn't campaign on the first one. I guess they didn't say they wouldn't do the HST, so they didn't run into the BC problem, and we don't have referendums, thankfully, here, because you can, in my view, either have representative democracy or you can have direct democracy. You can't have both at the same time. But I'd say it would be really refreshing if, when on the 27th you moderate the debate, if the three of them actually said, look, you know, we went into this campaign and things were looking, they're looking steadily worse. And so maybe we all have to put a little water in our wine and accept that the province has to remain on a sound financial footing. I don't
even
think,
by raising taxes.
Well, and even by raising taxes. I mean, I think what's gone on at Toronto City Hall has a lot of Torontonians saying, you know, like my trainer said, you know, I'd be happy to pay that car registration fee. You know, like I don't want my libraries closing. I don't want daycare spaces closing. There's been a very big public, noisy kind of demonstration that actually people are willing to pay a bit of tax to keep services. And, I think some people are taking the lesson from Toronto that, well, you just don't want to elect those kind of people. But I think the right lesson is, when you really kind of take the lid off public spending, the gravy train is about this big, and the service thing is most of it. And yes, you can deliver services better, and there's some saving. But there's no big machine somewhere at Queen's Park chewing up the tax dollar.
Let me get your view on this, Jim. Tim Hudak today, the leader of the Conservative Party, wrote to the Ontario Elections Commissioner, I think it was, saying, I want to let you know that we are going to adhere to the Taxpayer Protection Act. So we will not raise taxes, we will not raise fees, we will not raise tax rates, we will not introduce new taxes, and if we do, we'll have a referendum and make sure that the people sign off on it. Is that an advisable thing to do?
No, absolutely wrong. I mean, first of all, he's cutting taxes. He's not just promising not to raise them. He's got substantial tax cuts in there, which doesn't make sense either fiscally or economically, in my view. The stimulus effect that you get from tax cuts is very small compared to the stimulus boost that you get from spending the same amount of money on infrastructure or public programs. but more is how I really don't like how that caters to a kind of populist tax rage mentality that's out there. And it's really easy to go out and push buttons in the electorate and say, you know, you're getting ripped off, the government's reaching into your pocket, demand fair treatment, not take it anymore. Mr. Hudak's campaign has done that. The NDP campaign has done that, frankly, in some areas. So no one is clean on this, and I think it really undermines the integrity of our ability as a society to collect the taxes that we have that pay for the services that we all benefit from.
Matthew, let me follow up with you on this. Dalton McGuinty, before the 2003 election, signed the Taxpayer Protection Act, said, I won't raise your taxes, then of course famously went out and did so. Tim Hudak has written that letter today, although he was part of a government when Ernie Eves was the premier that violated the Taxpayer Protection Act, brought in new tax increases without a referendum. So there's no more virgins on this file. Why do people keep wanting to play this card?
I'm not sure. I think it is viewed to be toxic within the electorate, but I agree with Michael that I think it would be a great question in a leaders' debate to ask if there is continued deterioration of the global economy and the forecasts on which your platforms are based turn out to be unrealistic, how would you manage that? What would you cut? Would you raise taxes? Those kinds of issues. Now, I'm not sure whether you'll get a clean answer to that.
I can tell you right now you wouldn't, but anyway, that's okay.
But I think I do think that's a really important question for voters to be asking, because as I said at the beginning of this program, I'm charitable towards political parties, and they formulated their campaign platforms over several months based on public forecasts. But the world is evolving, and it could evolve in ways that are mostly negative economically for Ontario's fiscal plan. So how do these leaders and these parties plan on dealing with it? And when Michael says there's not, you know, a big machine at Queen's Park that chews up the tax dollars, he's right. But there are big, huge spending items that we have to look at, not just in the macro sense, what's the overall deficit, but most of the money goes to compensation for public servants, and most of the money goes out the door as transfers to different institutions that the Ontario government doesn't really control, whether that's hospitals or schools or municipalities.
You couldn't get $15 billion more efficient, though, could you? I mean, there's not that much efficiency. Or waste or fraud or whatever.
Well, it's not waste or fraud, but I do think, and I may be naively optimistic, that you start to ask questions in each area. So in the post-secondary education area, university professors teach 2 courses. What happens if they teach 3? Okay, I mean, you start to save lots of money, and you don't necessarily.
It's the end of civilization as we know it.
But it's those kinds of questions about how we deliver our services and what people are doing who are delivering services that I think we have to start asking.
Let me ask David Dodge this. You know, it wasn't that long ago, it was 15 years ago, that there was a Conservative leader who actually got reelected 2 majorities in a row, promising to cut the hell out of government, to make government smaller. Mike Harris. Could you win an election today promising to not raise taxes, but lower that deficit by dramatically cutting back on expenditures?
I don't know whether you could win an election, but I don't think you'd survive till the next election. I think that's the real issue, because at the time that we were cutting in the federal level, that Mike Harris was cutting, we were incredibly lucky as a province and as a country, because for every dollar that we reduced public spending at that point in time or increased revenue raising, we were able to crowd in 75 or 80 cents worth of foreign demand at that time. We were very lucky going through that period. And that's what enabled us, as rapidly as we did, federally and provincially, to do what we did in the 1990s. We are not in that position today at all. Moreover, we started at that time with interest rates way up here, right? And as we progressed, rates came down and down and down. Today, we're starting with interest rates right at the bottom, and as we get out to the end of this next government's mandate, they're going to be considerably higher.
You also have a political problem. Because Mike Harris did cuts of that magnitude, Tim Hudak is trying very, very hard to say, I'm not Mike Harris. I'm going to protect health and education, which is over half the budget. And I think he's genuine in saying that, but it takes away his ability politically to be Mike Harris in the same way that you know, the NDP leader Horwath isn't about to come out for the social contract because she is the first leader not identified with the Rae government. So, you know, if your idea is an incomes policy as opposed to slashing the size of government, the two opposition parties are both, in a sense, hamstrung because of what was done by their predecessors.
Okay, but you've been inside government.
Yeah.
You know where the bodies are buried. Health and education is what, 70% of government spending?
Yes.
Okay, so you're going to find billions in efficiencies in the remaining 30% of the budget.
No.
Is that possible?
No, it is not. So no,
And that's where I'm very cautious about the pox on all your houses critique of all the platforms. I mean, yes, all the platforms start from a starting point, that Ontario budget forecast that is aggressive, okay, that's going to require some belt tightening as it is. But the Conservatives, because of that expectation that they can cut enough from non-priority areas to pay for everything else that they're doing without saying what that is nonsense, frankly. And we've got some experience now in Toronto with the Rob Ford administration here, which similarly said, you know, we're going to do this, we're going to get the gravy train out without cutting your services. And now Torontonians haven't experienced the cuts. They've just seen a list of what the cuts might be, and they're already rejecting that whole agenda. I think that's hurting Mr. Hudak's cause here.
I know you don't have to get elected, so take that issue off the table. But if you were going to do kind of a truth-telling session with the people of Ontario, you're going to go on TV, buy a half-hour TV time here on TVO, and tell people, you know, here's the straight goods. What would you tell them?
Well, just what we've been talking about around the table. I mean, this is the straight goods, and so the real issue that we're going to wrestle with over the next 4 or 5 years is how to deal with both service reductions and revenue increases in a way that is fair and appears to be at least reasonably fair. But let's recognize that the middle class is both the primary beneficiary of government services and the primary taxpayer. And so it's really, that debate is really going to be in the middle class. What services are you really willing to give up? Where do you think, no, I won't give up that service, but recognize I got to pay for it. And we got to pay for it now. We can't say we'll shift all the burden to our children and grandchildren down the line.
Jim, you know, of course, the Premier likes to say we haven't lost a single day in elementary or secondary school to strikes during the 8 years he's been in power. He always forgets about the longest ever post-secondary strike at York University, but that's another story. But in the elementary and secondary levels, they've had labor peace all across the province. Now, some would say they've paid for it. They've paid generously for it. If we're going into a time of austerity, where we're not going to see the kinds of settlements that we've seen in the past 8 years, can we assume that the days of labor peace in Ontario are over?
I think that depends on how it's done, frankly, Steve. You know, I think the more collegial tone of labor relations, not just in the public sector, but even in the private sector. Think of what the auto workers went through with the bankruptcy at GM and Chrysler. The government played a very constructive role bringing the parties together, facilitating something that could keep the companies here and cement their footprint in Ontario. That's the kind of approach that is, I think, a contrast to what was before. Now, times are tough, and everyone, public sector, private sector, knows that. Public sector settlements have come down dramatically in the last year or two, reflecting that, and they will continue to reflect some of that reality. So, again, I think it's something where you want to be careful to sort of walk a balance there. If you try to steer too much towards, you know, I'm going to slash and burn, then you can create more problems than you solve.
You negotiated the social contract, so you know these folks, you know how it works in there. You know, can you imagine there will be labor peace if the next government comes in saying $15 billion deficit, everybody's got to take zero?
You won't have labor peace if you do that. And because you've got arbitration on a lot of the sector, we won't actually get zero unless you legislate it. And if you legislate it, then you will certainly not have labor peace.
You're going to court.
But, you know, I like Churchill on jaw is better than war. Mm-hmm. And I think if there's an adult conversation, it would be great if it started in the campaign, but even if it doesn't, whoever's elected, if they do a lot of talking and a lot of explaining and keep the temperature down and do a lot of listening as well, I think it's possible to walk expectations down. I mean, I was at a dinner where Vicky Kaminsky, who used to run the health system in Sudbury and is now in Newfoundland, was asked by Bernard Lord a long question about, you know, what are we going to do about health costs? And his implied answer was, we can't cope. And she said, as a healthcare manager, if you give me 3%, I'll run the system on 3%. If you give me 6%, I'll run it on 6%. And I think there's a truth in that if there's an honesty with the public about saying, look, we have 3% or we have 2%. This is the envelope, and we've got to make some choices, but we're going to be open about it. I think it is possible to do it without having the front lawn at Queen's Park fully booked for 4 years.
I was going to say, they tend not to do that, though. What they tend to do is you offer 3, and then they say, they put some people in white coats in front of Queen's Park and scream bloody murder, and okay, then you get your 4 or your 5. Right? Well, that's how it works.
It does until it doesn't work that way. And I think if you start out very open and say, look, this is the situation we're in, you know, and we can do this the hard way where we make all the decisions in a closed door room and then we impose them on you, or we can do this in a more open way where we actually lay out what the situation is. And I think the federal government, when David Dodge was at Finance and Paul Martin was there, did lay out the situation facing the country. And yeah, not everybody liked it, but you know, it came to be the accepted wisdom in the country that we had to, you know, put our finances in order. And there's a pace question, which I think is an important one. But you know, you can't have wages go up at double the rate that government revenues go up, and I don't think you get any dispute about that.
In which case, let me ask this. We've got a few minutes left here, and I think it's fair to say that voters will start to engage a little more as we get closer to Election Day, particularly with the leaders' debate coming up next week. We have all the parties' platforms on our website. If people went to the website, if they read the party platforms, or if they just sort of engaged a little more, David Dodge, what's the most important question they should be asking about what the parties are offering?
That's really difficult. I like the way Matthew actually put it earlier, and that is, the real issue is we're going to face some difficulties. What approach would you be taking to facing the difficulties? Because you can't nail it down on X, Y, or Z, some particular thing. But what approach? How would you come at this? And I think that's the real question to be asking.
Matthew, what would you say?
Well, I agree with that. I think
that's because I agreed with you.
I know. That was pretty obvious, but I didn't know how to say it. I think that all voters, have to look at how realistic the various platforms are. And look at the history of the people who are running and the parties and how they come at these issues and how they approach them, what values, based on past history, you would think that they would bring to a situation if they couldn't do everything in their platform.
Jim?
I would take a step back behind the fiscal plan of each platform and ask how is each party proposing to put Ontarians to work? Because there's nothing that will have a bigger impact on the size of the deficit at the end of the day than whether Ontarians are working, generating income, and paying jobs. And that's where you should go to the plans, that both for traditional industries like manufacturing and the new industries like the green energy and so on. What is each party going to do to make sure Ontarians have a job?
Michael Decter.
Well, I agree with the jobs point. And it's worth pointing out that corporations are in a situation where they have very strong balance sheets. The dilemma the Americans have, which is partly the dilemma Canada has or Ontario has, is how do you get those corporations to create jobs in your jurisdiction without offending trade agreements and a whole lot of other rules that we've sensibly put in place. So it's not Buy Ontario policies or Buy America policies. Those are disastrous. But you've got to convince the corporate leadership that this is a good place to invest and now is a good time to invest. And that may have a lot to do with skilled labor. It may have a lot to do with building partnerships. But, you know, the dilemma is not that corporations are in bad shape. They're in, for the most part, terrific shape, but they lack an immediate reason to invest, and that lack of investment is holding back the recovery.
That's the last word for our program today. Can I thank our guests for coming into TVO tonight? David Dodge, the Senior Advisor at Bennett Jones, former Governor of the Bank of Canada, Matthew Mendelson from the Mowat Centre, and on the other side of the table, Michael Decter, President and CEO of LDIC, and Jim Stanford, the economist at the CAW. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.